All right, welcome to week 7, Nature versus Nurture. This week, this PowerPoint is going to cover all the basics, all the highlights. In class, we're going to do a lot of discussion, a lot of topics, really interesting stuff. But before we can talk about the interesting, controversial issues in this week's chapter or section, we need to get to the basics. So let's start. Now, what we're dealing with all week long is instincts. What is an instinct? How does it work? What's its purpose? An instinct is an urge or an idea to do something. And that instinct is a natural part of who you are, not something you have to think about much. Instincts can be inborn or developed through the way you live. For instance, a man living in the woods might have developed better survival instincts than a tourist if both were attacked in the woods. Now, we both understand that we have basic drives within us, instincts, if you will, that keep us safe. An example of an instinct is that when we are at the brink of an edge of a cliff, edge of a building, we start getting that queasy feeling. That's an instinct. That's your body kicking in saying, hey, something's wrong here. So let's get into a little bit more of what instincts are and how they affect us. Okay, so how do we use them? These are survival strategies or adaptations to specific conditions, but unlike physical changes, are not necessarily genetic. It is very important, although we're talking about a lot of genetic stuff, instincts are not genetic, they're hereditary. There's a little bit of a difference. We're going to get into that. Strategies of hibernation with bears require genes that alter the animal's physiology to slow heartbeat, lower temperature, and otherwise decrease its metabolism. Others are instinctive. Okay, so when we have something that's genetically hardwired into us, it's not an instinct. Okay, when we feel endangered, okay, when we feel uncomfortable, we know something could go terribly wrong, we start to feel uncomfortable, we start sweating and all those things. However, some survival strategies are learned behavior, that is, young learn from older animals. Okay, just like we were talking about earlier this week. For example, most predators teach their young techniques for hunting, successful hunting. Okay, it appears to be higher than the complexity of the nervous system of the animal. The more likely strategies are learned rather than instinctive. So, if you were raised in the woods, your parents would have taught you how to hunt and how to fish using all the resources at your abilities. Now, these are learned, okay, rather than instinctive. Most animals, the strategies are not conscious decisions. Okay, just think about the Hunger Games. That character wasn't really thinking about, I can't think of her name, wasn't really thinking about how to kill or how to hunt. Her dad taught her, and that advanced her own. Responses to stimuli such as hunger, thirst, asphyxiation, fear, and exhaustion make us react in a certain way. If I take away all water from you, you're going to begin to get this internal instinct of where you can find water. Okay? Instinct is a strategy that is dangerous. If conditions change, so the instinctive strategy is dangerous rather than beneficial, the animal can die. We'll be talking a lot more about the difference in class coming up. Okay, so let's get into the gene side of everything. So, one of the major focuses of this week's chapter is heredity, our genetics, what we are concretely made up of, the science of our body. Heredity is the transmission of characteristics from one parent to the offspring. Now, that is your hair color, your eyes, it's all of that. Physical traits, height, hair, and eye color, and psychological traits like shyness, leadership, aggressiveness, interest in arts and crafts. All of these are passed down from your parents to you. Your outgoingness, your desire, your love of reading, your passion about theater, all of those are passed down from your parents. Disorders like anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, and alcoholism are also passed down from your parents. So we get both positive and negative. Okay? We also get our physical as well as our psychological traits from our parents. So, the basic building block of our heredity is our genes. They're the basic building block. Everything starts with genes. Traits are pairs of genes, one gene from one pair of inherited from each parent. So, traits are the individual pairs of genes. Blood type, single pair of genes. Intelligence is a combination of genes. Okay? So, your intelligence is based on two of your parents. Your blood type is one single pair of genes. Chromosomes are found in all of our DNA. Most normal human beings have 46 chromosomes, which are all organized into 23 pairs. Psychologists try to find clues of the psychological traits and how the genes are paired. There's a reason why one gene is paired to another gene. There's another whole reason why one pair is connected to another pair. Okay? Without 46 pairs, without 46 chromosomes, physical and behavioral disorders result. So if something goes wrong with one of those 46 chromosomes, physical and behavioral traits change. Okay? So, 23 pairs, 46 chromosomes make up our entire genetics. So, how does nature nurture affect all this? First, we have to understand what the argument's about. Nature is the influence of our inherited characteristics on our personality, physical growth, intellectual growth, and social interactions. So, the nature is how our genetics, how our genes passed down from our parents have affected our personality, physical growth, intellectual, and social interactions. Nurture is the influence of our environment on personality, physical growth, intellectual, and social interactions. Nurture is the environment in which you were raised. Nurture is your own genetic code, your own genetics passed from both of your parents to you. Behavioral genetics focus on nature versus nurture, taking into consideration both of these arguments. Now, genetics and development, how do they interact with our heredity? It affects us in many different ways. First, it's important to know that genetics is the science of inherited traits. If you hear about genetic engineers, geneticists, all of these people are focusing on how our traits become inherited. Okay? A DNA, I'm not even going to try to spell it, say it out loud, is a special molecule that contains all of the genetic material in the organism. Okay? Well, what that is that tells you the code of how to make you. It takes all of your 46 chromosomes, your 23 pairs, and puts in a double helix, okay? And it is a special molecule that remember all the unique information about you. Okay? Genes are selections of DNA having the same arrangement of chemical elements. Okay? So the gene is the pairing of these two chromosomes. Okay? They have dominant and recessive type of genes, referring to a gene that actively controls the expression of a trait, and recessive only influences the expression of a trait. When we talk dominant, this is the one that we see, we experience, we outwardly have. Recessive is one that's inside us that we don't show, but when we reproduce, it may come out. Maybe come out if our husband, wife, or whatever has another recessive gene. We'll talk about recessive, dominant, recessive, all of that information in just a moment in a little bit more visual way. Dominant controls the expression of a trait. Like, for instance, the dominant gene in me is blue eyes. I have blue eyes. My mom has brown eyes. My dad has blue eyes. I have a recessive blue-eyed gene in me. Dominant, I'm blue. recessive, I'm brown. Okay, so if I get married and have kids, they're more likely to have blue eyes because I have blue eyes, and so does my fiance. However, our child could have brown eyes because both of us have recessive brown-eyed genes. Okay, we're going to talk about this. This may help you clarify some of that. Okay, so this is what a double helix looks like of DNA. It's two strands making up the sides of the twisted ladder of the DNA structure are composed of sugars and phosphates. Just so you know, the rungs of the ladder that link the two strands are amines. They contain the genetic code for building the proteins. Okay, this is what all of the blueprint of your entire body, personality, intellect, all of it is located in something that looks just like that. Okay. Now, if we take our DNA and we break it down, this is what our genes are going to look like in human genetic material. Okay. If you've ever looked at CSI or anything like that, they're making connections of, this person has this DNA. This is what they're looking at. They're not looking at the double helix or anything. They're looking at genomes, human genomes, which is exactly what this is. So if you commit a crime and they're trying to match your DNA to the crime scene, this is what that DNA is going to come across like. So nature, just summarize the whole debate. Nature is what you inherit, your biological groundwork that prepares a person to develop in certain ways. So my parents gave me a certain amount of genes. Okay, the nature argument refers to the ability of those genes to be used. Nurture refers to the environmental factors, what a person is exposed to in life, family, education, culture, living conditions, and everyday individual experiences. Nature is strictly your biological given gifts. Okay, give what both your parents have given you. That's it. Nurture takes in your family, education, living conditions, and experiences. So the major argument is how much of who we are is found in our genes versus how we are raised in environmental conditions, nurture. This is where the whole argument. What are we more shaped by? Our genes or our environment? Okay. Now, we were talking about earlier, when we talk about nature and nurture, we're talking about our dominant and recessive genes earlier. Here's a great visual explanation of dominant genes and recessive genes. Each of these brown-eyed parents carry one dominant genes for brown eyes. The dominant gene's brown because they have brown eyes, and one recessive gene for blue eyes. So they have brown eyes, but they have a recessive gene for blue eyes. The children represent the possible combinations of each parent's gene. Each parent could pass the dominant brown-eyed genes, resulting in a brown-eyed child with no recessive genes, 1 chance out of 4 possible combinations. One parent could pass the dominant gene while the other passes a recessive gene, resulting in a child with brown eyes who carries the recessive blue-eyed gene, leading a child with blue eyes who carries 2 recessive genes for blue eyes, 1 chance out of 4. So, if you have brown eyes and a recessive blue-eyed gene, 1 out of your 4 children are probably going to have blue eyes. Finally, each parent could pass on recessive blue-eyed genes, okay, leading with this. All right, so when you take the math into consideration, if you have 2 brown-eyed parents, 75% of their children, 3 out of 4, are going to have brown eyes. 1 out of 4 is going to have the recessive blue-eyed gene. Now, in your biology class, you probably did something like this, okay? Your little Mendel box, who is the father of recessive and dominant genes, okay? So, the dominant is the brown eyes, the recessive is the blue eyes, which is the lowercase b, okay? So the mother, dominant, recessive. Okay, when you take them both into consideration, you can see which one is probably going to have what color eyes. The capital is the dominant. Okay, you can see that only 1 out of 4 is going to have blue eyes, because the dominant gene is the one that's going to show. Okay, we'll talk about it in class a little bit more to help clarify any questions. Okay, but when you do the math, 75% of brown eyes, 25% of blue eyes. Thank you, Mendelbox. So, genetics and development. How does this all play out? Chromosomes are tightly strains of genetic material or DNA. Chromosomes are linked to Down syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, and Turner syndrome, whereas genetic disorders include PKU, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, and Tay-Sachs disease. All of these syndromes and diseases are due to chromosome disorders. Okay, something is wrong with their DNA, which makes this disorder occur. So, when we look at DNA, we have to take into consideration the closest way, the best way we can study DNA. When we think about studying DNA, it's very difficult. My DNA is absolutely 100% different than your DNA. Okay? What makes us different? We have 2 separate parents, 2 separate things. One of the biggest tools of nature-nurture argument is the conception in the twins. Now, twin use in nature-nurture arguments are absolutely the most important thing. There's 2 different types of twins. The monozygotic twins, which are identical twins formed from one zygote, which is split into 2 separate masses of cells. Each one develops into a separate embryo. Okay, so zygote is a egg, your mother's egg, which splits into 2 and separates into 2 cells. Identical twins. Okay, we know this as identical twins. The dizoic twins, often called fraternal twins, are occurring when 2 eggs each get fertilized by 2 different sperm, resulting in 2 zygotes in the uterus at the same time. When we think of fraternal twins, it's like a brother and sister are just born at the same time. They're not twins, just born at the same time. Fraternal twins. Identical twins are same sex, look exactly the same, okay, formed from the same zygote, same egg. Okay, here's just a little visual for you. Identical twins, 1 egg, 1 cell, split into 2, and then they come up with 2 fetuses. Okay, fraternal twins, 2 eggs, 2 sperms, they develop into 2 separate fetuses. Okay, they're just ordinary siblings, but identical twins have the same genetic composition. Okay, so when we're dealing with identical twins, we have to know how common their genetics or their genes are. Identical twins, 100% of their genes are in common. Parents and children, only 50% of your genes. When we talk about parents, I'm talking about your mom and you. 50% of your genes are similar to your mom. Why only 50? Because you got 50% of your genes from your dad. Brothers and sister, only 50% of your genes are exact match to your brother or your sister. To your aunts and your uncles, only 25% of your genes match. And to your first cousin, only 12.5%. So, when we're thinking about comparing how our genetics and how our environment affect us differently, we can see why, just by looking at these numbers, why identical twins are the ideal candidates to study to figure out which one is more powerful than the next. So, what have we learned from these twins? Well, human behavior genetics is a huge part of this whole nature-nurture debate. Family studies based on assumptions that if genes influence a trait, close relatives could share that trait more often than distant relatives. Okay? So, what this whole argument is saying is that the more closely related you are to someone, the more likely that gene or that disorder or that trait is going to be had. So if I have schizophrenia and I have an identical twin, which we share 100% genetic genes in common, then they should have schizophrenia. Okay? Siblings of people who have schizophrenia are 8 times more likely. The children are 10 times more likely to develop the disorder. Okay? So when we look at this, it seems like, well, it's got to be genetic. It's got to be genetic if we have such closely related that it does prove that people who are closely related have more of the same symptoms. However, families also share environments. Most likely, we live very closely, especially with our parents, okay? So that doesn't always fill the entire argument. So human behavior genetics, close relatives share more traits, okay, more often than distant relatives. It's true, but we can't always tell 100% why. Now, twin studies and fraternal studies continue off the human genetics trait, okay? Twin studies and fraternal provide evidence for the ability of a number of behaviors ranging from verbal skills, aggressiveness, to mannerisms, okay? When we see one twin and we separate them out, they're still very much so similar to one another. For example, when one identical twin develops schizophrenia, the chance that the other twin will develop the disorders are about 50 cents. Okay? For fraternal twins who are just like other siblings, it's only 15%. So we can see how identical our twins really are, identical twins. The higher rate exhibited by twins, particularly identical, suggests that heredity plays a crucial part. Okay, so twins allow us to really see where things are coming from, whether it's environmental or whether it's heredity, or whether it's both. Now, adoptive studies are a huge part of the twin studies. Now, what twin studies are is when we take a pair of identical twins and we separate them, have them being raised in two separate houses. Now, is this done in the name of science? No. We're looking at people who are actually divided up amongst the people naturally. We as scientists do not say, oh, well, we're just going to divide you and your children and just in the name of science. This is not how it's done. However, twins have been divided up over the case of time, and we have studied what has occurred because of it. Adoptive studies focus on children who are adopted at birth and brought up by parents not genetically related to them, and the evidence of ability of intelligence and some form of mental illness, and a behavior thought to be solely determined by environmental influences. So we've separated these twins, raised them in two different households environmentally with people who are not related to them, and we have found that some twins develop anxieties and disorders because they're associated with them environmentally and not genetically. For example, of the 47 people who adopted, mothers suffered from schizophrenia. 5 adoptees subsequently suffered as well. So, if the adopted mother was schizophrenic, 45 out of the 47 also became schizophrenia. So, is schizophrenic a genetic disorder or environmental? Okay? But when we used a control group, there was not a single case. So we're still not 100% sure. But it raised a very interesting topic. Now, when you're looking at psychological and physical traits that you share with the members of your family, identify the traits that are nature-nurture. Okay? I kind of went ahead and did this for you. Color of my eyes are nature. Work ethic, you can argue, is it environmental or is it heredity? Height, I believe it's heredity. Sense of humor. Personality, I think it comes from both. I have a high level of stress, and my mom is the same way. Sense of humor, definitely heredity. I'm as hilarious as my mom is. Color, hair color, I get it from my dad. Athleticism, I think's nurture. I think if anyone's motivated, anyone can be athletic. We didn't say athletic in football or a specific sport, but athletic overall. Physical makeup overall, that's heredity. Intelligence, nature, and nurture. Okay? I think if your parents want to push education and think it's important, then their children are going to do better. Okay? However, I think you are limited by how much they give you as well. and termination, nature, nurture. Now, this is just my own perspective. It's really up to you about what you think. Stop and think about this yourself. Have this conversation with your parents. Like, where did this come from? Where do you think it came from? Because there's no 100% right answer. It's just a process of working through the difficult questions. And these things scientists are still working on and they can't figure out. But it's an interesting argument, an interesting perspective. Okay, so what are some studies done by nature, nurture, and geneticists looking at and finding? There's a study that came out in 1973 at the Institute of Personality and Social Research in Berkeley, California, that among 400,000 people, showing that after the firstborn, intelligence amongst all children decrease. What that means is firstborns have the highest intelligence. Now, as a middle child, I would argue this. All right, on average, study found that firstborns have a higher IQ by 2 points. Okay, now, does this mean they're naturally done, or is there a nurture side? People argue that there's a nurture side because it's true the firstborn children are given much more parental attention, fostering intelligence, also because they tutor their young siblings. Okay, so what's the true definition? Firstborns are smarter genetically, or is it because they receive more education and more attention from their parents? What is the answer? No one really knows. Lots of research has been spent on this and will continue until we get a concrete answer. Okay, so let's talk about chromosomal abnormalities. We've talked about the genes, you've seen the genes, now you'll see the chromosomes. Okay, it's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. Okay, so some normal chirotypes. Okay, these are what your chromosomes, your 46 of them, are going to look like normally. Okay, there's a male and a female. Okay, so here's your female ones on the left. Here are your right ones. These are normal. There's 23 pairs, 46 chromosomes. Okay, this is what normal heredity, normal growth, normal intelligence. Now we're going to start messing some up. We're going to be looking at some disorders. Now the first one we're going to do is we're going to look at Down syndrome. Now Down syndrome is a trisomy. Now what that is, it means that there's an additional chromosome added to your 21st. Okay? Now, when we're dealing with this, it's important to know that the male chromosome, the male identification is XY. XX is female for chromosomes. That's how you know. If it's XY, it's male. XX, female. Okay? So, what is Down syndrome? Down syndrome is a set of mental and physical symptoms that result from having an extra copy of chromosome 21. What happens is you're supposed to have 2 chromosomes in chromosome 21. There's an additional one there. That's what causes Down syndrome. Normally, a fertilized egg is 23 pairs of chromosomes. In most people with Down syndrome, there's an extra copy of 21. Also called a trisomy 21 because there are 3 copies of this chromosome instead of 2, which changes the body and the brain's normal development. Now, people with Down syndrome, now you're more likely to inherit or receive the extra chromosome to your 21st chromosome. The older you are, more likely Down syndrome is going to occur to your children. Okay, a trisomy is multiple copies of a chromosome is the most common cause of mental retardation. People with Down syndrome have an IQ between 25 and 74. The average IQ is 90 to 110, so that's pretty low according to our average. The result is a number of characteristic features: short stature, broad hands, stubby fingers or toes, a wide rounded face, large protruding tongue that makes speech difficult. Individuals with Down syndrome have high incidence of respiratory infections, heart defects, and leukemia. Okay, so the older a mother is, the more likely their child is going to come down with Down syndrome. Okay, lower intelligence, definitely different physical characteristics. Incidences, how often it occurs: 1 in 750 live births is there a child born with Down syndrome. Mothers in their early 20s have a risk of 1 in 1,500. So the younger you are when you have a child, the less likely it's going to occur. Women over 35 have a risk factor of 1 in 70. Okay, so if you wait to 45, you have a 1 in 25 chance to have a child with Down syndrome. Okay, so children with Down syndrome, this is just some, you can see by these pictures of what children with Down syndrome typically look like. You can see the wide set eyes, round faces, their tongues are larger than most and more protruding. Okay, Down syndrome is very low on mental retardation level. Okay, now Turner syndrome, okay, is a different type of syndrome. Okay, its genotype is XO. It is not linked. Okay, the older the mother is, it has no effect. It only affects women. Turner syndrome only affects women. Men are not affected with this. Women with Turner syndrome can live relatively normal lives, so they are unable to bear children. Okay, so you cannot reproduce if you have Turner syndrome. Okay, the phenotype of this female includes short stature, short broad neck, broad chest. Intelligence does not seem to be affected. So Turner syndrome affects women. It deals with their physical looks, not their intellectual abilities, unlike Down syndrome. Okay, and it affects the 19th chromosome. Okay, so Turner syndrome is a genetic condition which a female does not have a pair of two X chromosomes. Now, keep in mind, women are XX, men are XY. A woman with Turner syndrome has only one X, not two. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Chromosomes contain all of your genes and DNA, the building blocks of the body. 2 of these chromosomes, the sex chromosomes, are determined if you are become a boy or a girl. Females normally have 2 of the same sex chromosomes, written as XX. Men have XY. In Turner syndrome, cells are missing all or part of an X chromosome, which means a woman's identified by X, not XX. The condition occurs only in females. Most commonly, the female patient has only one X chromosome. Others may have 2 X chromosomes, but one of them is incomplete. Okay? Turner syndrome occurs in about 1 out of 2,000 live births. Now, women who have Turner syndrome have very large webbed necks. Okay? They have very broad shoulders. Okay? They have genetic, physical changes to their body, no intellectual limits. Okay? So, some sex-linked abnormalities. Okay, it's very exciting. We're going to talk about the Superman, the Supermale, Superman genetic manipulation. All right, so we're going to talk about the Klinefelter syndrome. This is when men have 2 X and 1 Ys. Okay, it happens to the 47th chromosome. This person who gets this person who contracts the Klinefelter syndrome has XXY instead of just XY. Okay, so they have an extra chromosome. Klinefelter syndrome is what type of mutation would cause a person to have an extra X chromosome. Okay, it happens in about 1 to 500 males. Affects a person being relatively normal. Abnormalities include tall stature, sterility, which means they cannot reproduce, and enlarged breast. This only occurs in males. Turner syndrome, females. Klinefelter's, males. Down syndrome, both. Okay? Now you can see a normal male to the left and an abnormal or Klinefelter syndrome male to the right. Now the Klinefelter male is a taller stature, has narrow shoulders, okay, small testes, infertile. A normal male has XY, a Klinefelter has 2X and a Y. Okay, Klinefelter syndrome, also known as the XX condition, is used to describe males who have an extra X chromosome in most of their cells. Instead of having the usual XY, these men have XXY. Even though all men with Klinefelter syndrome have the extra X chromosome, not every XXY male has all those symptoms. Scientists believe that XY conditions is the most common chromosome abnormality in humans. About 1 in every 500 males has an extra X chromosome, but many do not have any symptoms. So you may have an XXY chromosome, extra chromosome. You may not know it or have any of the abnormalities, of which I'm going to explain what can occur. And the XXY condition can affect 3 main areas of development: physical, language, and social. XXY males have weak muscles, reduced strength. They may sit up, crawl, walk later than other infants. Okay? They tend to be smaller and have less muscle control and coordination issues. After puberty, they often don't make as much testosterone as other boys. This can lead to a taller, less muscular, less facial hair, less body hair, and broader hips than other boys. As a teen, XY males have larger breasts, weaker bones, and lower energy level. Okay, XXY males can have normal sex lives, but usually make little to no sperm. Between 95% and 99% of males are infertile, cannot have children. Language development is affected by Klinefelter's syndrome. About 25 to 85% of XXY men have some sort of language problem, whether it's talking late, trouble using language, expressing their thoughts, reading, trouble processing what they hear. They have a harder time doing work that involves reading and writing, but hold most jobs and have successful careers. Social development: as babies, XXY males tend to be quiet and undemanding. As they get older, they're usually quieter, less confident, less active, and more helpful and obedient than other boys. As teens, they tend to be shy and quiet, struggle in school and sports, and have trouble fitting in. Now, this is a very common syndrome that typically goes undiagnosed. So, XXY, Klinefelter's. Okay, here's just an interesting diagram that I saw that put the Klinefelter syndrome and the Turner syndrome directly in correlation with one another. Klinefelter affects only males, Turner affects only women. The Klinefelter, frontal baldness, poor beard growth, tendency to lose chest hair, breast development, osteoporosis, female type pubic hair pattern, small testes, tall stature, slightly feminized physique. This is all describing what happens with Klinefelters. Now in Turner's, for women, low posterior hairline, okay, webbing of the neck, broad chest and widely spaced nipples, okay, streak ovaries, infertility, pigmented nevi, and peripheral lymphoda at birth, okay. So this puts them at a direct correlation with one another. Alright, so those are the big highlights from this week. In class, we're going to be discussing some big nature nurture topics. We're going to see a couple video clips, a couple genetic things. It's going to be a great week, and I look forward to sharing the rest of this information with you. I hope you guys do well, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Have a great week.